Coming up, we'll talk about the history of the situation in Venezuela and see how it's got a lot in common with the Yellow Vest riots in France. That's right now on today's Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, Chuck Holton here. Hope you're having a great week. If you haven't seen episode 57, my interview with our Iraqi interpreter and humvee driver, Mahamad, you definitely should make time to go see it. People are giving me great feedback on it. They love it. Thanks so much for all you who are supporting the podcast. It was kind of a slow start, but now we've got new subscribers joining every day over at patreon.com/hotzone, and we're seeing encouraging growth across all our platforms. Very shortly, we're going to be live on opslens.com and their new app, which should be online hopefully this week. Okay, the Yellow Vest movement marched again in France over the weekend, with more than 50,000 people taking part in those marches across the country. There wasn't as much violence this time, only a couple dozen arrests, but the grassroots movement really shows no signs of going away. And they continue to call for the resignation of French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, let me just give you a little refresher on the Yellow Vest movement. The protest started over 15 weeks ago, back in November, with some of the most violent riots that have been seen in France in years. And if you're confused as to what exactly the Yellow Vests stand for, well, that's understandable, because there are lots of elements of both the far right and the far left in that group. Basically, it's become kind of a catch-all for anybody who's dissatisfied with any aspect of life in France. Some say taxes are too high, others say they need more taxes, but only on the rich, of course. Some are calling for social change or an increase in the minimum wage. Others are just there to take advantage of the chaos and pillage and burn things. It's all kind of started over a hike in the tax on diesel fuel. You probably know that gas prices in Europe are far higher than the United States, upwards of $7 a gallon in a lot of places. But diesel has normally been cheaper, especially in France. Well, Macron's firm commitment to the environmental accords agreed to back in Paris in 2015 led him to hike the tax on diesel in 2018 and had planned another hike for the first of this year. Now, people who live outside of the cities and blue-collar workers were disproportionately affected by those hikes, as you can imagine, since they tend to drive more. And there's no end in sight for those increases, since France has committed under the Paris Accords to actually ban gas and diesel vehicles completely by 2040. Well, the taxpayers finally got fed up, and 15 weeks later, here we are. Now, there have been over 1,800 casualties and 15 deaths that have been attributed to the protests. And at the peak, there were nearly 300,000 people taking part in the marches out in the streets. Macron has made a lot of concessions, like lifting new gas taxes, a freeze on electric utility prices, an increase in the minimum wage effectively, etc. But his approval rating is still only about 25%. By comparison, Donald Trump's approval rating, as bad as it's portrayed in the media, is usually somewhere in the 40s. Part of the reason for this is that many people in France are unhappy with the flood of migrants, many of whom end up sleeping on the streets, the increasing crime in the cities that goes with that. I made a Frontlines episode about that a couple years ago. Check it out.
Europe is undergoing a massive transformation as millions of immigrants surge north out of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, drawn by the prospect of generous social programs and a better way of life. In the last few years, the numbers have been staggering. 1.8 million migrants in 2015 alone, and it's causing tensions among the EU member states as countries like Greece, Hungary, and Sweden shoulder a disproportionate share of the burden. And a corresponding uptick in immigrant-related violence has spawned a populist uprising that is sweeping the continent. Paris, France, once synonymous with romantic getaways, fine dining, and world-renowned artwork. In recent years, however, it's become better known for horrific scenes like Charlie Hebdo, the Bataclan Theater, and other massacres, all with one thing in common: radical Islamic jihad.
Well, of course, the French culture has been changed. Society is becoming more and more violent. A culture of confrontation has been important in France. It's not only the responsibility of the immigration, it's the responsibility of the politicians who have really hidden the topic, who have refused to confront it. They were not taking responsibility to tell the truth to the people and trying to assimilate these people.
Our government became too much social. Those people, they come here and they want it all, they want it now, and the government to give to those people what a lot of people, French people, don't have.
It makes heavier the burden for the other people who are working, and then it attracts people who want to live on this welfare state. You're losing the best, you're getting, I won't say the worst, but you're getting people who want to live with the welfare state. The balance is broken.
Tensions are high in France, which has seen more than one terror attack per month since the terrible attacks on the Bataclan Theater and National Sports Arena in 2015. But French politicians are convinced the best way to combat this violent trend is to keep French citizens unarmed. We just found a gun store here. All of these guns you see, though, are not real. They have guns that fire blanks, they have airsoft, and they have BB guns, as well as some hunting rifles. But it's not possible to buy a pistol here in France. We went yesterday to Bataclan. Those attackers used rifles, grenades, and explosive vests. All of those things are illegal in France. If I live here and I want to get a pistol and protect myself, I'm not allowed to do that. You have to understand the culture in the United States. It's much, much different. I mean, I carry a pistol everywhere in the United States. I go to the bank with a pistol. I go to church with a pistol.
Well, then you can defend yourself if a bad guy is coming. That's the problem. That's the problem we had at the Bataclan. When the bullets were coming only from one side, nobody could fire back.
I realize the culture is very different here, but has there been any talk about I should be able to defend myself?
Well, this is not a debate. This is not in the public debate.
No.
I mean, if I raise this issue, I would be considered as a nutcase. You know, the guy's insane. Okay, it just doesn't make sense.
It's not even
it's not an option. It's nobody. I mean, not a single candidate at the presidential election would come and say, look, I want to make you be able to carry a gun. You know, I've spent so much time in the States, so I really understand the difference and how it seemed bizarre. But, I mean, had people had guns at the Bataclan, it would have been a different story.
Anti-government rioting has also swept the nation. And there are some places around Paris the police say they just won't go. That means citizens in these areas are left with no good options for protecting their families, as the government's ineffectiveness has been shown during recent violent protests.
The police has not the ability to stop the rioters. They don't have the right to fight back. So this is why you can see all these cops, you know, for example, when they're torching their cars with a policeman inside. That's insane. Mm-hmm. And you know, the policeman who just went out of the car and who didn't fight back against the rioters got the Medal of Honor from the French Minister of Interior, which is absurd. I mean, the guy has been praised for not responding to the rioters.
They're not being allowed to even defend themselves against the rioters?
Not only that, their recommendation is don't defend, don't fight back, and if you get hurt, you'll get a medal.
Fox News coined the term no-go zones in France. The rest of the mainstream media has jumped on them and said that's fake, that's not true, there's no such thing. Is it true or not?
Well, ask the police. Ask the police if they want to get in some areas. Ask the firemen, ask the ambulances. Mm-hmm. They know they can't get there because they will first create more turmoil, and second, they will be under assault in some areas. They don't want to take the risk, so these are no-go zones.
They exist. They don't like to see police there. When police officer, patrol police goes there, they send them things with fire or big...
They get attacked.
Stuff. They get attacked. People are afraid. They are afraid.
Well, that's no way to live.
It's not a way to live.
We traveled around Paris to several of the so-called no-go zones. We were warned not to be seen filming in those areas, so we used hidden cameras to record what we saw.
No police.
No police. You don't let the police in here.
Yeah.
No police.
Police ici. Police ici. Top.
So we were just approached by these two young men while we were filming, and between my broken French and their broken English, they communicated to us that we had to be careful filming around there because there was a lot of drug trafficking, and that if the police showed up, it would get very bad between them and the police. They did not appreciate police presence, and that if there was police in the area, that there would be a fight. While on the outside, things don't look that bad in this neighborhood, under the surface, there are some tensions that are right at the boiling point.
We need to transform our internal and foreign policy. You cannot deal with terrorists outside and fight terrorism inside. These are the same. I can't tell you how many people coming from Syria would become terrorists here, but I can tell you that the huge majority of these people coming to Europe don't want to live the way we live. They don't want to adopt our European way of life. They're pretending that they're fleeing a country and societies which are living under Sharia law, but they're trying, when they're getting here, to impose this kind of social order.
Those people that don't feel comfortable here and the way the French people, European people live, I think they just have to just go back to their home.
How does
Like
it
they
make you
want.
feel that those people don't want to go back to where their worldview is normal? They want to make you live like they live. They want to change
I
the
will
way
never
you live.
do that. If a third war comes, I will be the resistance. I will be Matahara, trust me. No, that will never, no.
You're not going to wear a burqa.
I will not, never.
It was clear during our visit that France is facing a crisis of culture that may not be reversible, and there are some unsettling similarities with issues we're facing back in the U.S. And unless our people can effectively defend our Second Amendment rights against those who would disarm us, we may be facing a very similar future.
So look, if you're looking for a lesson in all this, I think there are several things that Americans can kind of take away from the Yellow Vest movement. So let's just list them out here now. Number one, people don't like tax increases for anything, especially something as conjectural as climate change. Whether or not it's actually happening, that's beside the point. Anytime government promises people something, it will eventually come to be considered a right. And violence will happen if that benefit ever goes away. That's number two. Number three, the idea of taxing people out of doing something that's central to their livelihood, like driving, is pretty dangerous. Number four, socialism is progressive, like cancer is progressive. France is already in the top 25 countries in the world with the highest standard of living. That means like 88% of the nations on the planet Earth, people are worse off than they are in France. But people in France are burning the country down, demanding better wages, shorter hours, cheaper prices. And those things are all sort of self-contradictory if you think about it. In order to even try to deliver on all those demands, France would have to substantially increase taxes, but of course only on the wealthy. And France already taxes its citizens north of 45% of their income. The wealthy have been fleeing that country for years over the heavy tax burden. So socialism consumes wealth and industry and still can't ever fully deliver on its promises to the common man. So we've seen that over and over again. Let's pivot, for example, to Venezuela, which is kind of the case in point for how democratic socialism ends up. People there are way past the tax the rich stage, and they're down to the eat our pets stage. Over the last week, we've talked a lot about what's going on in Venezuela, the mayhem, poverty, the despair. More than 3 million people have fled that country, and a whole lot more are going to follow if the current regime doesn't fall pretty soon. See, 30 years ago today, the streets of Caracas were on fire. People were looting and burning the city in protest of, take a guess, an increase in the price of fuel. It came out to be called the Caracazo. Some say more than 2,000 people died as the government came in and violently repressed those protests with a heavy hand. Now, this is before Venezuela fully embraced socialism. They were leaning left at that point, no doubt, but politicians like to do what all politicians like to do, try to buy the votes of the poor by redistributing wealth from the rich. but their champagne taste didn't fit with their beer budget, and the government had borrowed heavily to pay for all of its promised entitlements to the people. So in late 1988, when the new president, Carlos Andrés Pérez, proposed to move things toward fiscal responsibility by removing subsidies on fuel, the effect was a 30% increase in the cost of transportation. And people took to the streets in protest because they deserved those prices, even though those prices were subsidized. Now, I've never understood why people think they gain by burning down their own neighborhoods. But that's kind of how the mob mentality works. Once people get infected by the mob, their actions cease to make sense. And rarely does it do any good for the country. In Venezuela's case, the government ended up suspending the Constitution, violently suppressing the riots with things like extrajudicial killings, torture, disappearances, and so on. One of the soldiers carrying out those orders was a previously unknown Venezuelan military colonel named, you guessed it, Hugo Chavez. In the political instability that followed that whole thing, Chavez and his henchmen began planning a coup, but was later found out and put in jail. He then got pardoned by President Pérez's successor and was then elected president himself in 2002. Chavez's campaign platform went like this: free health care for all, including pets, believe it or not, free college, social justice reform, we've heard that before, forced compliance with environmental reform, you've got to replace all your light bulbs, land expropriation and wealth redistribution to the poor. Does any of this sound familiar? I mean, seriously, sometimes I think Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are plagiarizing speeches Hugo Chavez gave in 2001. Nevertheless, this is what began a 20-year decline into the socialist pit, an untold suffering by millions of people. Now look, I've done my best here to simplify a complex and thorny issue. And to be fair, corruption in the government played a big part in the decline and fall of Venezuela, as it has with many other countries. But now you know a little bit more about the story of how Venezuela got to where it is today. It was called the Caracazo, and what France could very well be looking like tomorrow. Okay, that's all I got for today, folks. Thanks for going with us on this adventure. If you have suggestions or other feedback, please put them in the comments below. I'll read every one of them. So I'm Chuck Holton, and I'll see you back here tomorrow on The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.